Welcome to the 2025 Teach Access Student Academy. I am Rolando Mendez, Director of Education at Teach Access. For those that might just be joining, welcome to the Teach Access Student Academy. We are excited that you are spending time with us to learn about disability and accessibility. We just concluded with the keynote speaker and have 5 more sessions today and 6 sessions tomorrow. Before we start, I just want to make sure that you know a few key items. Captions, we have captions provided by a live captioner. So to access those, you can click the CC icon in the bottom menu bar. ASL, to view the ASL interpreters, find the interpretation button at the bottom menu bar. With an icon that looks like a globe, click that and select American Sign Language. And a new window will pop open that you can move around your screen for preferred viewing. Q&A, feel free to use the Q&A feature to send questions during the session. Everyone will be able to view these questions, which can also be submitted anonymously. If you have any other questions, concerns, or accommodation needs during the session, use the chat feature and send a message to the hosts and panelists. The session will be recorded and made available to everyone after the event. So before starting, we would also like to thank our sponsors for helping make this free event possible, presenting sponsor Merck, and also our support from Verizon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, and Salesforce. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Alan Hejl, founder and lead consultant for CPACC Access, to present Introduction to Disability Inclusion. The room's yours, Alan.
Thanks, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I don't know if I would have said yes if I know I was following Haben and Laney with such an amazing keynote today. But hopefully a lot of what I'll cover in my presentation will echo some of the lessons that you heard from the keynote, and will leave breadcrumbs to all the other sessions you'll hear today and tomorrow with just a snapshot of some of those basics of disability inclusion. So give me a moment here to share my screen. If folks can confirm that that is being broadcast now. Great. As Rolando said, my name is Alan Hejl. I'm the founder of CPACC Access. Just a little bit of what we'll cover today. I'll give a little bit of my introduction and who I am as an accessibility professional. We'll talk a little bit about disability demographics and vocabulary, some of which, if you tuned into the keynote, you've already heard some of the words, but we'll iterate on some of those definitions. And then really talking about disability inclusion from an action perspective and what those mean just out in the world with different principles, everything from policy, universal design, inclusive design, and some of the nuance in that. And then by the time we get to the end, coming up here on the half-hour mark, we'll have some Q&A. So you can ask questions throughout, and Rolando can feel free to, if it's on point with the discussion, feel free to let us cover that while we're on that slide. If not, we'll try to address as many questions as we can at the end. So I want to talk a little bit just about myself and my journey, really building CPACC Access as an independent consultancy, and building it off of my lived experience with disability. I'm a professional with chronic nerve pain, ADHD. I've given up running between kind of that temporary disability of different running injuries. And I also, my wife, Emily, is a wheelchair user who works in the automotive industry. And we've really built a life together that has disability at the core of our identity. I'm a disability-owned business with Disability In. I have credentials through IAAP as a certified practitioner of Accessibility Core Competencies. And I'm based in Ferndale, Michigan, so not too far from University of Michigan, where I also have disability inclusion and accessible design. They have a short program there. A lot of my experience is built out of the auto industry. So being here in the Metro Detroit area, it's hard to find anyone who doesn't work for one of the auto manufacturers. And through an experience at Ford, where I was actually a connectivity engineer working on autonomous vehicles and the future of 5G in vehicles, that led to working at General Motors. And I just started asking way too many questions about disability and accessibility that I had the opportunity to build a whole department at General Motors around accessibility. And now I do that independently of working primarily in the transportation industry, but also teaching organizations how to build accessibility, disability inclusion into their culture. And a lot of that's born both out of my personal life, but also through volunteering in the community before I was doing it professionally, between volunteering with Detroit Disability Power and the work that they do locally in Detroit. I'm a board member of Michigan Disability Rights Coalition. And I also have just a little commission with my city of Ferndale, which is just north of Detroit, where we really lead accessibility and inclusion at all the different layers of city government. One of the things I think that when I think of accessibility and disability inclusion and the need to address it, I was really struck by this was years ago. An Instagram artist called the Pacing Pixie posted this, and it really struck me as the best way to explain why accessibility is important to people who haven't been exposed to it before. And so you have this inaccessibility cycle. If something's not accessible, then disabled people are unable to participate. If disabled people can't participate, then they're not visible to the public eye. Then the public starts to view disability as this outlier or rarity. And then it leads to people not wanting to consider disability, not wanting to consider accessibility measures. And it creates this cycle that just perpetuates itself. So it's kind of a simple diagram, simple concept that if we don't include people with disabilities, we'll always view it as this outlier and a minority group that doesn't need to really be addressed. And what we'll talk about is how that's absolutely not true. uh, and a lot of disability inclusion and accessibility really works to dismantle this cycle at all of these different layers. One of the things I wanted to open with is really addressing this myth that disability is this fringe minority that even when we talk about kind of the modern concepts of DEIA, people often focus on race and gender, and we're sometimes lucky if disability is mentioned kind of at the end. Um, but I think what a lot of folks don't know, or maybe on this audience do know, is disability is the largest minority group in the world. And some of the sources of the data, the CDC publishes just about every year, they update their statistics. But 28% of the US population, more than 63 million people just in the US, have disabilities. 17% of the global population, and that's reported on by the World Health Organization. More than 1.3 billion people around the globe have disabilities. Added to that is aging population. We have what I think I've heard AARP called the silver tsunami, where across the globe we have the baby boomer generation that's set to double our population over 60 in the next 25 years. And with age comes a function of disability as well, as bodies wear and tear, as our medical systems have continued to improve. People live longer now across the globe than they have before. But with age also comes disability. Added to that are temporary disabilities. I live in Michigan. I've already revealed that in Detroit. We've had a really big winter this year, and I know two people right now who are stuck at home with broken legs just due to slips on the ice. So a lot of people have experience with temporary disabilities throughout their lives. When we think of disability, we often think of physical disabilities first. It's the visual expression of disability that's harder to ignore, easier to understand. But it's also what we see when we go to use the restroom. It's the accessible icon is usually on those restroom doors. It's when we go to the grocery store. It's in the parking lot. Physical disability is often the most represented when we think of disability identities, but what a lot of folks don't know is most disabilities are non-apparent. And they cover the deaf and hard of hearing community. They cover disabilities with blind and low vision, cognitive and emotional disabilities, speech disabilities. These are just some high level categories. The list goes on, though, of things that could be chronic illnesses, different subcategories of all of these. And once you start to understand the breadth and the fluidity of disability, you can really start to see why this is such a huge demographic and why it's personal to all of us on this call. Most people will have firsthand experience with disability, if not their friends and family members. And ultimately, disability is something, again, you can age into, can be incident based and can happen to you at any time. So really understanding that power, that disability is just a natural part of life, helps you start to focus on it. And the one plug I'll give is for folks with cold hearts that don't understand the importance of the demographics and the population impact. Accenture also publishes an annual study and to kind of talk to numbers and benefits. When we focus on disability inclusion and accessibility, it also leads to just better customer outreach, better employee integration, and companies and folks who really focus on this work. The dollars speak for themselves, and there's higher revenue, higher net income, higher shareholder return. And that's really been proven through this Accenture study that gets updated every few years. But I highly, when we get into disability, it is just such this broad part of life. Let's talk a little bit about terms. So I've said the disability word quite a few times. We've talked a little bit about those different identity monikers. I've got a list here of a few definitions explaining disability, accessibility, ableism, and intersectionality. And it's a lot of words on this slide, but I'll just read through them kind of verbatim because there are a lot of different definitions for each of these words. And what going through all those definitions, finding ones that can really resonate with the communities you're in is the most important. So maybe these aren't your favorite definitions of these words, but these are ones I've found to be really striking and really powerful for what they mean at the end of the day. So disability, my favorite definition comes from the United Nations. So having a global definition of disability can be really important when we seek to address different models out there in the world. The UN defines disability as persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And something I really bolded in that definition is that focus on the interaction with various barriers, which means disability can be a function of your environment, and it can be a function of the world you're in and the community around you. And it's not just about a medical diagnosis. It's not just about what someone may personally be going through, but it's about the barriers present in a community. Accessibility, this is something from our past administration in the US, but when they announced what DIA means, I think this definition of the A for accessibility really rang, where the term accessibility means the design, construction, development, and maintenance of facilities, information and communication technology, programs, and services so that all people, including people with disabilities, can fully and independently use them. And I think that's a really succinct definition for what's really complex of it's addressing the built environment and architecture. It's addressing the digital environment and the world we see through our phones and computers. And it's addressing events and services through that programs and services part. So that's a really kind of powerful definition of accessibility, as you'll hear the word a lot between today and tomorrow, to also hold on to. Ableism is a term that means something different to everybody. And one of my favorite definitions comes from Emily Ladau, who wrote the book Demystifying Disability. Um, and she defined it as ableism is the attitudes, actions, and circumstances that devalue people because they are disabled or perceived as having a disability. And one of the nuances with ableism is, like every ism, it comes in different flavors. It comes in ultimately day by day. It can be perceived differently. It can also be internalized. And something that we often don't talk about enough is how ableism is sometimes within us as people with disabilities. As a professional with ADHD, my biggest enemy is my executive dysfunction. And there are days that I really hate it and I really need to get stuff done. But walking my dog sounds way better. And those are days that I really feel ableism kind of towards myself and how my brain works and where my motivation comes from. And there's flavors of ableism that we can have as disabled people, that as we start to better understand ourselves, we can spread that education to our friends, family, and community. I don't want to use ableism as a binary term, but it really does come in kind of all flavors and situations. And then a really important concept is intersectionality. So intersectionality is this term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw that covers the intersecting of identities. And intersectionality is this metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that are often not understood among conventional ways of thinking. And the biggest example I give for intersectionality that touches on disability and race happened in Michigan. Folks are familiar with Flint, Michigan. It's a majority Black city. They had their water infrastructure was disinvested in for years. Essentially, there was intentional lead poisoning of that community through neglect of a majority white kind of power structure of the Flint community. And exposure to lead for children and adults creates disabilities. And so when I explain intersectionality from the lens of race and disability, that's like a key example there of it's a majority Black city that was intentionally created to be an environment that creates disability. And so that's kind of disadvantage in a nutshell that is a mistake that we're still making up for. Um, one thing I wanted to start to get into is principal salad, and it's starting to unpack different layers of policy, what universal, accessible, and inclusive design all mean, and how we can start to think of the different layers in our community and the different ingredients that have to come together to create accessibility that ultimately leads the way for disability inclusion. Something we cover a lot is, from the US perspective, is referring to the ADA, which is a civil rights law that really guarantees that we won't discriminate against people with disabilities when it comes to our buildings, our programs, really anything that a person with a disability could be interacting with. That's a civil rights law that guarantees we won't discriminate. That being said, it's only as good as how that's interpreted in different corners of the world. So you'll get federal policies and technical standards that both precede the ADA and have come after. You'll have state policies that have to have that interpreted when it comes to housing, transportation, building code, education. And then ultimately, one of the things I enjoy a lot being on some local commissions are local policies of what can you do in your literal backyards when it comes to ensuring that your city has an ADA transition plan, that your local zoning is really empowering going above minimum standards for accessible housing, or impacting the master land use plan, which is it addresses everything from parks to how information is conveyed to residents. there's a lot of opportunity to get involved with local policies. A principle you'll hear often is universal design, and that's something that comes up all the time in accessibility. It was coined by the Center for Universal Design with North Carolina State University in 1997. And it really is meant to address the physical environment first and foremost with its list of 7 principles of equitable use, flexible use, simple and intuitive, having perceptible information, having a tolerance for error, requiring minimal physical effort, size and space in both approach and usage. And a lot of these are rooted in physical design and have started to really, as we've gotten to understand digital design over the decades, have also been mirrored in digital design, but in some different ways. So one of those aspects of digital design, and I think you'll hear about this a lot more in some other presentations, is POUR, ensuring that information is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Able to work in different modes and different functions, able to work with assistive tech, are really these key principles that hold to our digital environment and standards. A lot of these also kind of intersect with the physical world and physical environment as well. So understanding universal design from the physical side and then the POUR principles from the digital side really help you build a view of where the digital and physical worlds meet. And again, this is just a snapshot of this principle that you'll hear more about. I'd say the really important one that sticks with me is inclusive design. And some of the best definitions out there that I have for inclusive design come from the Ontario College of Art and Design with their Inclusive Design Research Center. And you'll see that kind of cited at the bottom of my slide. But they really define inclusive design as design that considers the full range of human diversity with respect to ability, language, culture, gender, and other forms of human difference. And it's really set out to recognize diversity and uniqueness, support inclusive process and tools, ensuring that people with disabilities can be part of the design process, and understanding the broader beneficial impact. So understanding that leaning into inclusive design and designing for people with disabilities, you're also looking at kind of the bigger picture at the same time. Inclusive design really empowers a system where you're designing one solution for one individual and respecting the individuality of that design process along the way. My favorite concept in inclusive design is the virtuous tornado. And this is again from OCAD. But it really focuses on iteration. And I have here a graphic of a tornado that shows the design process happening in different cycles. And ultimately, the outcome is a much better accessible design. So with a focus on iteration and improvement, you relieve the anxiety of getting something perfect the first time. Accessibility is always a journey. There are always missteps that can happen. There's always going to be, no matter how inclusive of an event you're trying to run, no matter how inclusive of a product you're trying to make, there's always going to be this lagging question of who are we leaving out? And there will be people that you're leaving out, whether intentionally or not intentionally. And the virtuous tornado is kind of the answer of that, of you're always developing new cycles and new improvements that can help you get at it. I'm going to skip this slide, but I want to cover, so that really covers the heart of inclusive design, universal design. I want to touch on this example of universal design that we see in almost every training that mentions universal design. It's this picture of a staircase. It's very kind of gray on gray. This is a real place. It's Robson Square in Vancouver, and it was built in 1979. And it's this massive staircase with a ramp that snakes its way up through it. Unfortunately, it's not the best example of universal design. And it's one that, as it exists today, doesn't meet building code in Canada. And it's due to lack of different safety elements like contrast, where the ramp meets the stairs, or due to a lack of handrails where the stairs are, and understanding the nuance of um, uh, why a lot of people use the ramp is they also need the assistance of handrails. So I wanted to start breaking down some of these myths that universal design can be very static, and that leads to kind of a lack of iteration when we think of universal design. And the difference is inclusive design is a constant push to improve and iterate. And it maybe doesn't uphold like what had been universal design in the past. Inclusive design can answer changes for the future. The other example I love giving in this, and this is a Michigan story, but it's the curb cut effect. And we often hear the curb cut as an example of universal design. And I'd say that's true. The curb cut is this artifact that has invaded every part of our society. Every walkable community out there uses curb cuts. Um, but it's an artifact, I'd say, more of inclusive design than universal design. And the curb cut goes back. The first image I have here is Battle Creek, Michigan, where Jack Fisher was the creator of the curb cut in both Kalamazoo and Battle Creek. Fast forward, the curb cut was improved to be usable for power wheelchair users, and a lot of folks know Berkeley, California as the origin of the curb cut. That also wasn't a perfect curb cut. It didn't include the blind community. And what we saw around the globe were different solutions emerging. Japan's one of those examples of 10G blocks that can navigate through kind of entire subway stations with tactile paving. And the tactile marking was added to the curb cut to provide kind of a safe stopping point for blind pedestrians. So you have the curb cut, I'd say, is an artifact more of inclusive design, of it's an accumulation of all of these changes and elements over time. And I'd say it's still not perfect. And I've been in parts of the world that I'd say have better curb cuts and better street crossings. And so there's kind of a never-ending loop when you think of inclusive design, and the opportunity to better lean into disability inclusion and to better iterate. I had one more slide, but I think I'm gonna kind of end with my key lessons are just as you think about disability inclusion, and you learn more between today and tomorrow. Remember nothing about us without us. If it's about disability, always center people with disabilities. Inclusive design really leads that way for one size fits one when it comes to solutions. And ultimately, this work does take a lot of energy. It does take a lot of being proactive and reactive and working with the community you're in, and get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Mistakes happen all the time. Um, Sometimes ASL interpreters don't show up on time. Sometimes there's miscommunication behind some accommodations. But always handle it with grace and know that as you learn more, you'll always be able to do better. I want to stop there if there's time for a few questions.
Thanks, Alan. This is Rolando speaking. We have two questions from the audience. The first one is, why do you feel the percentage of disability is so much higher in the United States as opposed to globally? Why is this not a constant across the board? Thank you.
That's a really great question, and it comes from different demographic studies count disability in different ways. And I'd say the US is ahead of many parts of the world when it comes to acknowledging mental health and learning disabilities. At the same time, we're one of the only developed countries without things like universal health care and access to proactive health care. And as I told my story of Flint, Michigan, we have examples where we have communities that intentionally or unintentionally do create disability. And I come from a line of folks from rural America who are predisposed to a lot of like risks for type 2 diabetes and other things. And I can talk about that for a long time as well. But I'd say there's a lot of factors in the US that lead to disabling environments. But we count disability a little differently. And I think one profound difference, I'm thinking of China really has a long way to go to acknowledge mental health disabilities and how it counts its demographics.
Thanks. Fortunately, that's enough all the time that we have for this session. We'll try to get the additional session to you, Alan, to see if we can respond it asynchronously. Thank you so much for this great session. We now have a 1 hour scheduled break. We will close the Zoom room. Please join us back here at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific time for the next session, Disability History for Technologies. This session will take participants through disability community basics and history from the early 90s to the present, 1900s to the present, sorry. She will focus on how this context and knowledge can inform more respectful and engaged technology research with disability communities.
Great, thank you, everyone.